Kazakhstan is a constitutional republic with power concentrated in the presidency. The government and constitution concentrate power in the presidency. Kassym-Jomart Tokayev became president in 2019 and was re-elected in November 20 snap elections. These elections were marked by a lack of competitiveness and limitations on free speech and freedom of assembly that narrow the space for critical voices. According to an observation mission by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, the executive branch controls the legislature and the judiciary, as well as regional and local governments. Changes or amendments to the constitution require presidential consent. On June 5, the country held a binding referendum on approval of 33 proposed constitutional changes to rebalance the division of state powers with the stated aim to reduce the influence of the presidency and strengthen other institutions. Many observers welcomed the initiative, which followed the political turmoil and violence of the January unrest. Independent observers, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, stated that the referendum, which was announced 1 month prior on May 5, took place in an environment short of genuine political pluralism, with no active campaign and a lack of meaningful political debate on the substance of the proposals. The Ministry of Internal Affairs supervises the National Police Force, which has primary responsibility for internal security. The Committee for National Security oversees internal and border security, as well as national security, anti-terrorism efforts, and the investigation and interdiction of illegal or unregistered groups such as extremist groups, military groups, political parties, religious groups, and trade unions. The committee reports directly to the President, and its chairman sits on the Security Council. Civilian authorities maintained effective control over the security forces. There were reports that members of the security forces committed abuses. On January 5 through 8, as part of an apparent internal elite conflict, criminal elements incited to violence initially peaceful protests in several cities, which led to attacks on government buildings, security service personnel, and critical infrastructure. During the government's response to the violence, authorities detained approximately 10,000 persons, most of whom were subsequently released. 238 persons, including 19 law enforcement and military personnel, died because of the violence, according to the government. Widespread allegations of torture and abuse in police custody were reported, including 6 deaths attributed by the government to unauthorized interrogation methods. Authorities restored order during a 15-day state of emergency that included a complete blocking of the country's internet for several days and a short-term deployment of peacekeeping units of the Collective Security Treaty Organization, of which the country is a member, to provide site security for critical infrastructure in Almaty and Astana. At year's end, investigations into the most sensitive cases, including those involving allegations of torture, abuse of power, and treason, were pending. On November 3, Tokayev signed a general amnesty applicable to over 1,400 of more than 1,600 civilian and police participants in the unrest who did not commit serious crimes such as torture, abuse of power, or treason. The government reported the amnesty had been applied to 1,086 individuals as of late December. On December 22, the Prosecutor General's office announced that 1,249 persons had been convicted in connection with January events, with sentences including 160 prison terms for crimes including theft and participation in riots. Immediately after the January events, Tokayev announced several reform measures to address grievances raised in the initially peaceful protests, including reforms to reduce the power of the presidency, remove powers previously given to First President Nursultan Nazarbayev, whose family members appear to have been involved in inciting January violence, and strengthen political pluralism and human rights protections. Implementation of these reforms was underway as of December. Significant human rights issues included credible reports of unlawful or arbitrary killing by or on behalf of the government, torture by and on behalf of the government, harsh and sometimes life-threatening prison and detention conditions, arbitrary detention, political prisoners, transnational repression against individuals in another country, serious problems with the independence of the judiciary, serious restrictions on free expression and media, including violence or threats of violence against journalists, serious restrictions on internet freedom, substantial interference with the rights of peaceful assembly and freedom of association, serious and unreasonable restrictions on political participation, serious government corruption, significant restrictions on workers' freedom of association, and existence of child labor. The government selectively prosecuted officials who committed abuses, including in high-profile corruption and torture cases. Nonetheless, corruption remained widespread, and impunity existed for many in positions of authority as well as for members of law enforcement agencies.